A clip of the trigonometry guys interviewing Ben Shapiro is currently blowing up across right-wing Twitter. In the clip, Ben explains why young Americans must be willing to leave their families and chase better economic opportunities as they're priced out of their increasingly expensive hometowns.
Affordability is not like Beetlejuice, where if you just say it over and over, it suddenly arrives. You actually have to pursue policies that are likely to alleviate an affordability problem. But if your solution is always give me more power, and it does seem like that is the solution of the day from both sides, actually, then you're likely to just continue penduluming one side to the other. Because people don't want to learn the actual lesson, which is if you actually want affordability, then either you have to change policies or change locations. Those are really the only two things. And also, I think more broadly, it's not about affordability. We have trained an entire generation of people to believe that if their lives are not what they want them to be, it's the fault of systems, as opposed to decisions that are in their own control. And politicians absolutely have a stake in selling that. A lot of people in our industry have a stake in selling that. It makes people feel good about themselves and bad about the world. And the reality is, if you want a better life, you should feel better about the world and worse about yourself until you actually, go do the right thing. And if you wanted to make a political difference, what you would do is you would relieve the building regulations. You would make it easier for people to build, not harder. You wouldn't rent control, because if you stop rent controlling, then that creates incentive for people to build. You would allow people to build up further. You would get rid of many of the code regulations that are kind of antiquated. Like there are things you actually could do. And then if you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. Yeah, I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up. But the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity. And if the opportunities are limited here and they're not changing, then you really should try to think about other places where you have better opportunities. Again, that's not saying that public policy can't change. I think it can, but I think that the solutions being offered are untenable.
I want to start with the framing here. Ben's statement very obviously implies that the external causes of our situation are practically unresolvable. The concept of systemic change is rejected as impossible, while he tacitly tells us not to blame the system. But the stark reality is that nearly all of our problems, including affordability, would be immediately resolved, not by true policy changes as he suggests, but merely by implementing a few simple things: genuine enforcement of the already standing laws, the rectification of our currency base, and the deportation of the immigrants in this country. And yet I don't see Ben Shapiro or any of our political executors calling for restorative action like that. Instead, he calls for building deregulations. But why are the obvious solutions, which have historically always been the default positions of governments, now ignored entirely or declared wishful thinking? Why is it insisted that you need to instead sacrifice all the things which bring joy to life just for some obviously soulless economic opportunity far away from home? Because fundamentally, these people are not actually trying to fix our problems. You'll notice that instead of trying to correct our blatantly corrupt and baseless financial system, we're being offered 50-year mortgages and 15-year car loans. By the time we're 78 years old, we may even be able to hold the deed to our house. That is, of course, after paying the bank the original value of the home price 5 times over. And across that span of time, all the money we managed to stow away will have been, of course, devalued by at least 500%. That's the American dream, after all: eternal debt enslavement until the twilight years of your life. You'll also have noticed that instead of facilitating those promised mass deportations and canceling the 55 million work visas, which would immediately relieve the excess demand for housing and open up the job market for Native Americans, Trump is now pushing for more Chinese students to come and supplant our population. Instead of going after Antifa and giving these criminals real consequences in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, law enforcement is arresting a 20-year-old because he said, "Fuck the Jews," to a Jew who does no favors for the stereotypes. Through an uninformed lens, these types of actions may appear to be misguided. Maybe it's incompetence, perhaps systemic roadblocks that limit any sweeping, pointed action. Maybe they're just being realistic. But this behavior pattern has reached a level of consistency which is now definitively proven an unfortunate reality. Each side of the approved political dichotomy is not, in fact, in competition with the other. Their actions serve as perpetual catalysts for the response of the other. Just as two hands of the same body are serving the same brain, so do the approved factions of the left and right. The problem is created with the left hand and solved with the right. What must be understood, though, is that even the proposed solution never intends to really fix the issue. The proposed outcome will first appear to be a reasonable, centrist compromise, something that has weaved through intensely bureaucratic limits and managed to come out the other side as a clunky answer which makes most people roll their eyes in disappointment. But that is not what these solutions are. At their heart, they are a mechanism to drive something that would otherwise be impossible to push on its own. And it consistently trends towards more managerial control, more civilian enslavement, and more personal restrictions every time. Do you think 50-year mortgages truly have your best interest at heart? No. It pretends to solve a problem while embedding further control and denigration of your life. And we're seeing this across the Western world. The playbook is the same regardless of the country. When Keir Starmer came out in opposition to illegal immigration, did he declare a mobilization of the military along the English Channel? Did he declare harsh consequences for illegals upon detainment? Did he propose any of the solutions which are so self-evident that they hardly need articulating? Nope. Instead, he demanded that all citizens will now require a digital ID if they want to remain working in the UK. So they flood the country with immigrants, come out against it, and instead of deporting them, they use the destruction of your country to now justify and implement a solution which also happens to benefit their hidden objectives. Digital ID will now expedite the construction of their civilizational panopticon, and you still don't have a country left. They don't care about getting immigrants out, because if they did, they would solve it tomorrow. And we're tragically seeing the same methods deployed by our American right too. Whether it's real ID, anti-Semitism laws, or whatever it happens to be, they're all actions designed to push an unseen agenda. Trump could stop all of these things, and he doesn't. Likewise, Shapiro is exposing himself here as being obviously fraudulent, because again, everyone knows exactly how these things can be solved, but instead he tells you that you need to move away. It would be one thing if he at least prefaced the conversation by addressing the true issues, but instead he just goes on a Milton Friedman rant, and we're tired of that dishonesty. You have to list the problems. It's not just because of regulation, Ben, but I think more viscerally, we're disgusted by this hypocrisy of his opinions on Israel and Jews comparative to Americans and whites. In his statement, Shapiro implies that we, Native Americans, do not have an inherent right to stay living in our hometowns. Yet his entire life's work revolves around defending his people's right to stay in their supposed home halfway across the world. And he expects our country to defend that right. How about we get Israel to subsidize the rent for those Americans that can't afford rent in their home cities? This performative contradiction by Shapiro alone invalidates any idea that he cares about America aside from what it can provide Israel. If you'll remember, Shapiro has made millions off of telling white Americans that they should toughen up, that we shouldn't accept excuses for our failures, don't blame the system, don't blame others. But it's interesting what happens when he believes there's even a whiff of perceived racism against his people. Tucker has Nick Fuentes on his podcast, and he explicitly tells him that hating others for their inherent traits, like being Jewish, is anti-Christian and wrong. Doesn't matter. Shapiro believes Tucker is evil. The verdict is in. He'll then cancel his appearance on Patrick Bet-David after David had Fuentes on his podcast. He held a live struggle session demanding Megyn Kelly denounce Candace and Tucker in front of him. He wants swift action to combat the rise of anti-Semitism, but you just need to suck it up, Whitey. But Ben Shapiro made his most aggravating comment when he tried to appeal to the history of America. Do and live as your forefathers did. Keep the spirit of the USA alive, he commands. He says the history of America has been one of mobile pursuit for opportunity. Well, the history of America is also one of single-income families and a predominantly white populace with a Christian faith. You're telling me to stay true to the story of America, but it's a little hard when I see that the country now is 100 million foreigners, it's non-Christian at best, nearly satanic at worst, and families require dual incomes just to function at a baseline level. If you want to talk about us returning to the historic values of America, start there or keep your mouth shut, because you're just exposing yourself. We aren't going to move to Tulsa to become insurance consultants working in a cubicle making $950 a week at the expense of our families and hometowns simply because deporting 100 million people isn't realistic anymore. We let them in So why exactly was that realistic, but kicking them out isn't? But there is an important clarification to make about Ben's comments. You could easily try and defend his personal directive as being merely practical and rational advice for young people, and that may be true if it was coming from an uncle or grandparent. It's certainly foolish to try and persuade yourself that you have anything other than the hand you were dealt. From a personal perspective, you should always realistically assess your own position and determine how to move forward in a pragmatic manner. It does no good to yell at your boss about the amount of taxes taken out of your paycheck, and your dad will tell you the same thing. But logical personal instruction is not the job of our political executors and influential commentators like Shapiro. Their job is to actually diagnose the true issue and to then either call for or make real change which solves the root problem. Your job is to deal with the realities of your situation as they are and navigate it as best as you can. You don't have the power to change your state's law through your individual action. But if you do want change, your only option is to support and promote those with the actionable power to influence real change. People like Ben. But if Shapiro, our other political commentators, and elected politicians are simply shrugging their shoulders and telling us, tough luck, life isn't fair, why are we listening to them at all? We know that already. Some things are so obvious they don't even need to be said, Ben. But the key takeaway here is that we all want a life worth living, not economic prosperity at the expense of the soul of both our nation and ourselves.